Studies within my book is El Puerto Rican Embassy, yeah? Based on the ideas of the cultural promoter Eddie Figueroa, in 1990, photographer and conceptual artist Adal, along with Afro-Boricua poet and performer Pedro Pietri, reestablished El Puerto Rican Embassy, La Embajada Puertorriqueña, that is a still active mobile platform and space of creation and resistance for Puerto Rican artists, right? The conceptual embassy, una embajada conceptual, encourages cultural and spiritual self-determination, right? They call it like la embajada de la República Espiritual de Puerto Rico, the spiritual republic of Puerto Rico. And of course, this is because historically, Puerto Rico has been denied first by Spain and then the United States a self-sufficient and autonomous political identity. It's important to clarify that Puerto Rico is a US territory. Yeah, and more importantly, we need to say a US colony. Yeah. El Puerto Rico Embassy engages in the colonial poetics and aesthetics because it's presenting sovereignty, the sovereignty of minds, and of course, poetics. One of the central concepts that is also an act, an artifact, a document of the embassy is El Puerto Rican Passport Project. Through it, a literal Puerto Rican passport, something that actually does not exist, except for the Puerto Rico Embassy, within the Puerto Rico Embassy, has a text by Pedro Pietri, and it questions the imposed US citizenship. It affirms instead the construction of symbolic, non-territorial, because it's also incorporating the notion of Puerto Rican identity that is beyond the archipelago and is including the diaspora. And also, of course, talking about the possibility of understanding the Boricua identity as an emancipated identity. In my book, El Puerto Rico Embassy functions as an exemplary case, theoretical nodule, right? But also as an allegory of the interdisciplinary poetic practices Boricua has been building since the 60s to carve spaces of artistic and discursive sovereignty outside of US mainstream media, outside of the academia, university, and institutional spaces. I want us to contextualize, the passport project, but also El Puerto Rico Embassy. I brought like a short video so we can like probably engage in discussion after our presentation.
Since we're talking about El Puerto Rican passport itself, I initially was thinking in how El Puertorriqueño reaffirms his identity outside of Puerto Rico. So we felt that as part of that process, we could invent a new ritual, a ritual that could substitute the old rituals and traditions like Promesa de Reyes and things of that sort on the island, but for Neo-Ricans, for the Puerto Ricans in the diaspora, that could be a sort of ritual and have an object of art that could be emitted that people could take home that would reaffirm their identity and through which they could self-realize themselves as well. What's interesting about a Puerto Rican passport, besides being a process of self-affirmation, is that it also subverts with some sort of humor the documents that are normally used for control by the state. So that was the intention behind that particular piece. This conceptual passport was used by Pedro Pietri, my collaborator in the Puerto Rican Embassy Project, as well as by Ricardo León Peñavilla, who was our ambassador de la Palabra Without Borders. And Pedro used it in entering into Paris and Milano and Cuba. Ricardo was able to use and have it stamped going into Curaçao, Venezuela, and Colombia. And you have to think that there must have been some sort of a co-conspiracy going on between the artist that presented the passport and the agent that was stamping it. The images are out of focus on the passport, and then I went on to develop it into an actual series of images of my friends and my Puerto Rican colleagues, as well as just people that lived in New York, like my super and the domino champion from down the corner. The idea being that through some sort of trauma, psychological, emotional, the assemblage point of the individual had been shifted, causing them to be rendered out of focus as a process of the mental colonization. Curious enough regarding the passport, an interesting story I want to share. This professor from University of Hawaii gives me a call and says to me, I don't know if you're aware that they are exterminating all of the Coquises here in Hawaii. Somehow, with the farmers and the migration, they arrived somehow. Now, we thought for the longest time that the coqui was natural to Puerto Rico and could not survive anywhere else, but the conditions in Hawaii seem to be very similar for some reason. And acogió, no, meaning that it was able to survive. She says, we started a campaign to stop the extermination of these coquises. For you in Puerto Rico, the coquis makes a sound that's a symphony. But for us, it's very difficult because it's a very high pitch. And when you get hundreds of thousands of these little animals making the sound, it's excruciatingly painful. It's a decibel level extremely high and very difficult for the ears. So they had no choice, they thought, but to exterminate it. So she says, so we thought it would be a wonderful thing if you emitted a passport to the coqui and make it the national symbol of your country and a mascot, and we will use it to create a video around it, which they did. They ended up creating a video around the campaign to stop the extermination of the coquises. They used the passport right up front to introduce the video, and somehow they were able to at least stop for a while until they went into some legislation to try to stop this. And I felt actually very proud that I had a little to do with that campaign and that process.
So I would like to move on and also talk about my teaching. The previous section was mainly about my current research, but now I would like to talk about my teaching. In specific, I would like to use as a case studies the course that I'm teaching and currently teaching during the spring, that is called Debates in Latin American Social Theory, and that I have subtitled Black and Indigenous Futures in connection to our project in the Black Studies Colloquium, Black Futures, right? This is my description of the course. Yeah, through this course we have been, and this is something that that I'm reflecting. Yeah, currently reflecting on it. Yeah, through this course we have been examining, right, Latin American, Caribbean, and Afro-diasporic ecological thought, poetics, audiovisual media, and actions. And during the first part of the semester, we explore in a specific Maroon history, poetics, logics, and afterlife. We explore Maroon history and poetics within Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil as case studies. Yeah, and also within Afro-Latinx communities in the U.S. as well, right? And the second half of the class, right, that actually started yesterday, it's dedicated to examining hemispheric fights for indigenous sovereignty and the exploration of responsible ways of being and relating to our planet and manifesting futures. And for example, yesterday we were talking about the Zapatista movement in Mexico and their autonomous communities called caracoles, and the social work they're developing through these caracoles, or autonomous town in Chiapas in the south of Mexico. One thing that grounds this particular course, right, is of course the notion of Black and Indigenous ecologies. Yeah, the concept of Black and Indigenous ecologies builds up from the fact that imperialism, colonization, racialization have created direct and indirect segregation policy, displacement, and the establishing of literal and symbolic borders that separate the elites, yeah, from the historically marginalized. Yeah, and usually the historical marginalized are people of color, Afro-descendants, and indigenous people, yeah, mestizos, mulattoes as well, right? However, yeah, and this is something very important that we have been highlighting in our discussion, is like these marginal spaces, we're also considering them as location for cultural affirmation, just like el Puerto Rico embassy does, right? And also as social laboratories that promote dignified life. Yeah, so here I feel like there is a connection between my research, my current research, right, and this particular class and the notions of Black and indigenous ecologies. Some of the learning objectives of this class, Debates in Latin America, Black and Indigenous Ecology, is to learn, yeah, from maroon and indigenous self-sustainable communities, right? Some of them still thriving in the present, such as the one in San Basilio de Palenque in Colombia, yeah? In a specific, we want to examine their survival skills, their creativity, their resourcefulness, their drive towards freedom and worlds otherwise. Yeah, we also have been the first day, we dedicated the first day to as a way to do a significant land acknowledgement. We also explored the cultural affirmation of the Lenape people in New York on the East Coast, and also their goal, right? Their struggle right now of developing an Lenape Center here in Manhattan, right? So that is also has been part of our discussion. We started in New York, and from New York, we went to Latin America. And at times we return to the United States into Afro-diasporic, Afro-Latinx communities. We have explored, yeah, through different examples about exploring different artists and cultural producers. We have been exploring how the maroon communities and the indigenous communities have created options outside, yeah, of colonial states and or coloniality and large. Yeah, and I just want to remind everybody, right, like coloniality signifies the legacy of colonialism, even when officially the reality is post-colonial, right? We have been analyzing how maroon and indigenous community have developed ecological thoughts and practices, and how these formations propose relationships not just between humans, not just between Afro-descendants, not just between indigenous people, not just between Afro-descendants and indigenous people, something that we have seen, yeah, the alliances between these groups, but also between all living organisms, right? Plants, animals, right? Ecosystem as a whole, yeah? Both, yeah, maroon communities recognize historically and to this day recognize, and also indigenous communities as well, they recognize the duty to take care of life and the planet as an organism, right? As part of the class, we just recently, yeah, my students presented a series of projects, their midterm projects, and these are just like some of the examples of the work they have been doing in the classroom. For example, a podcast on recovering the history of the Lenape as New York history and their ecological and diasporic conceptions, right? So that first class marked this particular student, and he was like really invested in describing the processes of colonialism by using the Lenape as a case study, right? Similarly, another student wrote a short story from the point of view of a contemporary Lenape young man who tells the story of his ancestors and the violent displacement that came with colonization. Yeah, it's important also, like for me to know that in my class, every student have the possibility of engaging in analytical work, but this analytical work can be expressed through different types of analytical exercise. Some of them are more traditional, such as essays, right? But we also have been developing creative and public scholarship, such as podcasts and creative writing projects, along with reflections, analytical reflections. Yeah, some of the more traditional work has been essays and podcasts on the concept of race, something that we also have paid a lot of attention. and the idea of whiteness and blackness, yeah, and how it relates to European colonialism in the Americas, and of course how it fits those ideas, those logics, auto-modern logics justified the slave trade for many centuries. Yeah. Another thing that we have been doing is like looking at contemporary Maroon poetics in film, in poetry collections, and personal essays. We watch, yeah, and discuss the film Quilombo, a Brazilian film from the 80s that is kind of like re-examining the history of the Quilombos, the Quilombo de Palmares in Brazil. We also look at a poetry collection, We Are All, by the Afro-Mexican American poet Ariana Brown, and also personal essays such as the Afro-Puerto Rican, Afro-diasporic writer and poet Aracelis Guermey, and her examination of Maroon aesthetics and poetics within the circumstances, yeah, of the movement of Black Life, yeah, in 2020. This is something that I'm also like developing along with the Professor Rebecca Saloes from the Black and Latino Studies Department. We have a podcast that is called Latinx Vision, right? And right now we're in the middle, right, of developing and recording the season 2. The season 2 is all dedicated to Afro-Latinidades, right? And one of the episodes that we just recorded and that was the last episode that was released by us. It's Afro-Latinidades and poetry. And in this episode, for instance, we talked about the New Yorican Poets Cafe as a created space for Boricua and Latinx people of color, for the empowerment of the community and as a haven, yeah, for the development of poetics of Afro-Latinidad, right? We also have been discussing the casta system. The casta system, at least in the Spanish Latin American, is the base, right? The logics for the colorist practice that persists to this day, right? And also we have been looking at how like poetics, right, challenge official national narratives via the examination of Maroon communities. Again, here, like addressing the poetry collection We're All by Ariana Brown. So these are a part of the projects that I've been involved in sync with the class and in sync with the larger field of Black Studies. Lastly, I wanted to highlight that I'm also a writer, a poet, and filmmaker. And right now I'm precisely developing a project, a creative project that examines the history of rebellion in colonial Puerto Rico during during the 19th century, right? And I'm developing a bilingual poetry collection entitled A Dark Night Without Dogs, Una Noche Oscura Sin Perros, that is inspired by the archival documents presented and analyzed by historians Guillermo Barral and Benjamin Mistal Moret in their groundbreaking books, yeah, from the 80s, right? And this collection that I'm in the process of writing, right, and editing as well, not only examine practices of freedom, but also articulates networks of intertext from a growing archive on the topic of cimarronajes or marronage. Yeah, of course, my overall intention is to develop a poetic of Black liberation and to explore the ways Afro-descendants generated acts of resistance against slavery and colonialism. This is also because in Puerto Rico and many places in Latin America, the enslaved people are seen or discussed as passive subjects, right? And actually the history says otherwise, right? It's like this idea that there has been rebellions and resistance to slavery since the institution was embedded in the Americas, right? So I'm gonna now pass the mic, the proverbial mic, to my colleague, Dr. Angie Beeman. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Thank you for organizing this with me, Professor Robles. It's been really interesting to working with you, and I've had a lot of fun. I've been learning a lot. I apologize. I was kicked out in the middle of this. I've been having internet problems, so I think it interrupted the recording, but hopefully it didn't cause too many other issues. So I would like to share my slides, if I can here. Okay. Okay, so my name is Angie Beeman, Professor Beeman. I'm an associate professor in the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs. So I'm a sociologist who studies racism, and particularly the way that racism evolves over time, different expressions and manifestations of racism, which tend to, scholars, we look at how it sort of shape shifts depending on the political context. And I look specifically at colorblind ideology and racism evasiveness, and how these societal discourses affect progressive organizing. And so I've also examined diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, how faculty of color, particularly Black women and women of color, are affected negatively by these initiatives that are meant to be positive, to have a positive effect, and what we can do to actually better support women of color, particularly in white normed institutions. I present regularly for various organizations. I've presented for NASA. I'm going to do that again, maybe coming up sometime between May and June. The American Meteorological Society. So things that are, within the social sciences and also outside of the social sciences, anyone who's interested in applying this lens to their work. And most recently, I did a talk for the Association of Junior Leagues International to discuss Black Asian solidarity. My forthcoming book examines divides among progressives and the role of liberal ideology in silencing both racial and class oppression. And in this book, I've conceptualized racism evasion as the outcome of colorblind ideology. And I try to advance, rather than racism evasive, racism-centered intersectional approaches. So let me start with an explanation of what colorblind racism is, and this sort of evolution of racism and different types of racism that leads up to this idea of colorblind racism is kind of how I start a lot of my classes in thinking about these different manifestations. So this work on colorblind racism develops with scholars like David Wellman in 1977, who writes this book, Portraits of White Racism, and Leslie Carr, Randall Kennedy, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, Brown et al., who wrote the book Whitewashing Race. So looking at Wellman's work in 1977, he was stating first off that there's a problem with the way that racism is studied, and that particularly in his day, a lot of the research focused on surveys. And he felt like this was not really capturing what he would later call race talk, or what Eduardo Bonilla Silva would later call race talk, and that even in his day, people were not openly expressing racism through extreme ways, that they weren't extremist, they weren't openly racist, that they had sort of talk around racism, and that has to be captured through more in-depth interviews. And so that is what he did. He argued that survey research at the time tended to capture this picture, this Archie Bunker type of racist. So some of you may or may not have watched the show All in the Family. This was a sitcom that ran between 1971 and 1979. So some of you may have grown up watching it. I watched reruns of it throughout the 1980s. I watched quite a bit of this show, All in the Family. If you watch, I think it's Family Guy. I think that's a spoof on All in the Family. So what he means by the Archie Bunker type of racist is that this working class buffoon type of character who is very outspoken in his racist beliefs, makes overt comments. And the show is really about his relationship with his daughter, who was more of this progressive hippie type. So it was about how they navigated that relationship together. So it was a show that people could identify with in terms of that father-daughter relationship. And this is also what caused a lot of critique as well, because he's kind of portrayed as this lovable guy, like a lovable racist. You kind of see his development, and that's what the show focused on, his understanding of racism in his development. But what Wellman argued is that this is problematic. This is the image that we have of what a racist looks like, either openly racist or extremist, but that racism is not always expressed in that way. It can be expressed in other forms. It can be expressed by educated people. And so he was capturing that through these more in-depth interviews. And his research is followed by decades of research that address just that. Leslie Hautz-Pica and Joseph Fagan studied what they called two-faced racism. So what they find is that among highly educated people, and particularly they're looking at European American college students, that they've learned how to talk around racism or not to say racist things in front of certain people, right? But in private, they say more racist, openly racist things. But Benia Silva and Leslie Carr advanced this concept of colorblind racism. And so a lot of scholars of race and racism would argue that this is the dominant form of racism today. It evolved from earlier forms of racism. And what I've argued in my work is that this concept of colorblind racism is really jumbling a lot of things together into one concept. And so it can be confusing. And like people don't understand why is being colorblind racist? And I think part of the confusion is because there's so many things that scholars are trying to attempt with that one concept. So I sort of in my work unpack it as three separate but related things. First, you have systemic racism, which I draw from other scholars in defining it as a centuries-old and highly organized system of race-based oppression that operates at every level of society. So that's systemic racism. Then there is, you've got ideologies, different ideologies that hold the system in place. And one of them is colorblind ideology. And colorblind ideology is this seemingly positive belief, right? This idea that we don't see color, we don't want to see color, or we don't want to judge people by the color of their skin. So that's a societal pressure that people feel because they don't want to be judged as racist. So they claim that they're colorblind. The third component of this is what I see as really the problem. The outcome of that seemingly positive belief is a negative consequence, and that consequence is racism evasion. Okay, so by claiming that we don't see color, what we end up doing is claiming that we don't see or actively not seeing racism. So that societal colorblind ideology can then lead to racism evasiveness, not just in among individuals, but also within institutions, within our organizations. And this societal level colorblind ideology also affects scholars who study racism. So I've seen this in some of the concepts that scholars have developed. Noel Cazenave has looked at this as well in his book, Conceptualizing Racism. He talks about racially accommodative language. And so he argues that in academia, we tend to reward scholars who are kind of softer in the language that they use when they're talking about racism. We tend to reward racially accommodative language. And in the book Color Mute, which is listed here by Micah Pollock, she looks at middle schools and high schools in California who kind of have this policy of being color mute. And she talks about how she's also was affected by that in qualitative research. That scholars themselves are impacted by the kind of silences that they're studying, that they're impacted by the very racism evasiveness that they're critiquing. So we get these concepts like color mute. There's a concept called color evasion, power evasion, white fragility, microaggressions. We get all of these concepts that don't name what the key issue is. What are we evading? It's not just color that we're evading racism. And for some reason in our conceptualization, we're not naming that as the key issue. What is, that is the key consequence. So I look at how progressives engage in this racial evasion, racism evasion. People who want to be our allies, people who want to be anti-racist. Where are we going wrong? Where do we need to improve? How can we better organize effectively against racism and anti-Blackness? So in my book, I look at liberal approaches to racism, and these have been long critiqued, and I sort of trace some of the critiques in my book. So for example, at a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee meeting, also known as SNCC, in 1965, John Lewis stated, "White liberals and wealthy African Americans will sell us down the river for the 100th time in order to protect themselves." And Stokely Carmichael also stated that SNCC did not need white liberals. And around the same time, a Harlem activist stated, "White liberals are the slimiest snakes on earth." And in 1966, SNCC also wrote a position paper titled Black Power that addressed the role of white liberals, that was looking at the issue that they were having with organizing. with SNCC. And among other issues, this paper highlighted key problems with white liberal superior attitudes, a flawed focus on unity, paternalism, and liberal insensitivity to both Black and white workers. So therefore, SNCC put forth a new role for white liberals. And what they said is they should get their own house in order before they try to organize with us. And that's what's really causing a lot of the divides here. They addressed, I think, the same issue that Baldwin questioned. Do I really want to be integrated into a burning house? Baldwin stated that a vast amount of energy that goes into what we call the Negro problem is produced by the white man's profound desire not to be judged by those who are not white. And at the same time, a vast amount of the white anguish is rooted in the white man's equally profound need to be seen as he is, to be released from the tyranny of his mirror. So I believe what we are today calling white fragility is really a continuance, an extension of what James Baldwin identified in 1962. And at the same time, white liberals have addressed some of SNCC's requests. They have been organizing amongst themselves, having book clubs, having discussions, teaching each other about racism, having discussions on racism. But I think it's almost as if the critique of colorblind racism or microaggressions or whatever the white fragility, whatever the flash word is for the moment, that the critique of that has become almost vogue or fashionable in ways that what I've seen is that liberal white progressives will be criticizing other white liberals for not being woke enough, or, you know, that you're not, it's almost like a battle of wokeness. And sadly, my concern is that the purpose of this is not to become more woke themselves or to really understand and educate and try to correct some problematic behaviors or organizing, but to remain superior vis-a-vis other white progressives. So liberal white supremacy can be reproduced in progressive approaches to racism and also their approaches to working class issues, in that both methods operate to maintain a sense of moral superiority among well-meaning liberals. And so I find that while liberal organizations tend to be talk-centered on racism, radical organizations will take an opposite approach where they focus on action, which is good, but the way they focus on action and it focuses more on class and centers that while sacrificing really explicit discussions on race and racism. So for example, in my study of an interracial nonprofit community labor organization, activists of color and white activists argue that their organization addressed racism in their actions, so they really didn't need to talk about it, or, you know, they don't need to spend time talking about it. It's a waste of time. And the problem here was that, well, they're battling racial injustice as part of what they do, as part of their mission. That's what they feel they're accomplishing. And they don't want to talk about it because one of the arguments was that everybody has so many different understandings of what racism is and different definitions. But isn't that also why you want to talk about it, so that you start from a common understanding, a shared definition, so that when you are addressing the racial injustice piece of your organizing, you know exactly what you're talking about and you have a sort of response to that. And so in some of my interviews, I saw activists really struggling with that and even how to respond to that with their opponent because they didn't have that common understanding. And it is something that scholars who've looked at training manuals and anti-racist organizations, that they have noted that having a common definition of racism is helpful in being more effective in challenging it and doing the work, doing the organizing, doing the work. And I'm also looking here at differences in liberal and radical organizing approaches, confrontational versus non-confrontational methods. Often discussing racism explicitly is all by itself seen as automatically confrontational and divisive. So I look here at how liberal ideology plays a role in that, and liberal notions of civility, how that intersects with discussions on racism. And here are some blurbs that I've got for the book, and you can look on my website for some others, but I always find that scholars, when they read my work well, they are better at, I like the way that they characterize it better than I characterize it myself, or I'll be like, yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to say, and you said it better than me. And I'm just really, really happy, really excited to see Joe Fagan and Eduardo Benias Silva actually writing something that shows that they actually read the thing and actually responded, because I've respected their work for some time. So it's really exciting for me to have that. And in my other line of research, I've been looking at how the censorship and targeting of critical race theory, or not just critical race theory. I mean, a lot of us, I think others might characterize our work as critical race theory, but we don't characterize our own work that way. It's just that it's like this is like the political moment, or that's what people are familiar with. But I look at my work as just being a racism scholar, or racism theory in particular. But because of those attacks, there's attacks on diversity training. How are faculty and staff of color, how are they being affected by this? How has their work been impacted? What kinds of racial aggressions are they dealing with internally and externally within their universities? Our institutions are asking us, universities, corporations, to engage in this diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And we're also facing these political attacks, right? So as we're being asked to do this work more and more, what are our institutions doing to protect us from those attacks, right? To address some of those stressors that we're dealing with in the workplace. And this is an article related to that project, looking at the everyday work experiences of women of color professionals navigating white spaces. And I've co-authored this with Dr. Malaku, who I believe is here or was here in the audience. She is a professor in Zicklin in the School of the Department of Management. So here we're looking at specifically the impact of COVID-19 and incidents of racial violence, and how that has affected the experiences of women of color in their workspaces. Now in my teaching, so again, I'm addressing how racial ideologies change over time, and how that affects the practical ways that we can organize, how we can strategize to better promote equity. So I've taught courses on racism theory, race and ethnic relations, race, class, and gender, urban sociology. I've taught women in violence, and when I've taught women in violence, I've taught it from a very racism-centered and intersectional perspective. And I'm currently teaching race inequality in public policy. So in that course, I asked students to think about how different kinds of racial ideologies have informed different kinds of policies throughout history, how public racial discourse affects public policy. And when we propose solutions today, how can we use that knowledge to ensure that we're not making the same mistakes, right? That we're actually truly getting closer to promoting equity. So one of my students is looking at this semester, I don't know if he's in the audience or not, but he's looking at the military. He was in the military, I think he was in the Navy, and he belongs to some organizations today that are addressing this. One of the things that he has noted is, what are some of the practices and the language used in the military? So he was talking to me about how, we'll be told you're all going to be treated the same way. The military, we don't discriminate. The Navy doesn't discriminate. We all treat you like dirt. Everybody gets treated like dirt. So it's like this, how is this colorblind lens playing a role in these practices? Because at the same time that they say everybody's going to be treated like dirt, he says they're also saying everyone gets treated the same. You're all going to be treated like you're Black in the military. So I think he's going to have some interesting findings in his work. And then also I have the pleasure of having Jacqueline Ortiz as my student. I think Jacqueline may be here, and she has agreed to be a Black Life Futures Scholar and is doing some work. So Jacqueline, would you like to share a little bit about what you're learning in the class, or the project that you're working on?
I wasn't ready.
Hi. Stop share. I can come back.
Yeah. It's okay. So yeah, I actually have the pleasure of being a student in both Dr. Robles' Latin American Social Theory course and Dr. Beeman's Race, Inequality, and Public Policy course. And I'm so grateful that, Baruch offers courses like these where there's this space to talk about, Black life, past and futures. And it's actually the reason, well, actually, I think I've told Dr. Beeman this, but Dr. Beeman is the reason that I came to Baruch in the first place when I was doing research on what schools to go to. And I started, Googling something about my interests in racial theory, because that is where I'm headed in my continuing studies. And Dr. Beeman's, an article of Dr. Beeman's colorblind ideology popped up, and I just went in deeper and found this course. in the Baruch listings, and that's what changed my mind and had me transfer into Baruch. And I'm so excited and happy that I made that choice, because this class has been for sure already life-changing for me in the way that it has the way that it just describes and so openly, right, without with no filters, and say, like, it created this comfortable space to talk about all these really uncomfortable subjects. And I think that is the problem, right, in modern day race ideology, is this discomfort or this evasiveness, right, that, like Dr. Beeman was saying earlier, in talking about racism. And she's presented like so many, just this kind of the history of racism and how it continues to reassert itself, throughout our organizations and throughout all our institutions, educational, economical, social, and how we continue to like propagate this. And in only understanding these things, can we then, be informed and educated enough to like move forward the conversation and continue opening up these spaces. Because of my experience in this class, and also in Dr. Robles' class, actually, it has allowed me to open up these spaces, within my other sub-communities and subgroups in a more informed way, where I can be confident about what I'm saying, and at the same time allow the space and the patience, right, for others to kind of express their point of views, and be able to in some way kind of, reshape the thinking. It's a process, right? Like, we're all every day kind of acknowledging and realizing the things that tie us together, that connect us because of the diaspora. And so it's been very like a great experience. And sometimes it's emotional because this is heavy stuff, right? But it's great. Just yesterday in Dr. Beeman's class, we were examining how Asian Americans have been affected, right, by all of this, and how they're affected as with race ideology and by this concept of a model minority. And it was very touching to me to read some of these stories of Asian American students, or just Asian American immigrants that have come to this country, and just how much they relate to like my own story as a Hispanic as a Hispanic American, and others that I can relate, just to just expose how connected we all are. And that's why courses like these are really important, I think, to continue the conversation in a more informed way. So I think you both and everyone else that's here from the Baruch community, I hope that you guys continue to write these curriculums and to teach in the way that I've experienced so far. And I'm just really grateful to be a student here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Jacqueline. And I've seen in the chat, there's another student from my other section. So I think it's so great. I often, when I'm teaching two different sections of the same course, I just want to bring them together in one room. Sometimes I'll be saying like, that's what the students were saying this morning. And I just want to bring everyone together. But the students have been wonderful. I'm really looking forward to the projects that you're all going to be doing. And in the Q&A, if anyone wants to share anything more about some of the projects that they're writing. So what they're doing is they're taking a specific issue, a topic, and I've given them a list on the syllabi of different topics that they can choose from. Sometimes there isn't. One student brought me a project about looking at algorithms and racial biases and algorithms, and I didn't have that as a topic. And I'm like, I don't know. Let's make a list. Let's make a list so that next semester I can like have a list of books and resources for people to choose from. But she's going to do that topic. And I want them to look at what they've learned from the class in terms of how these ideologies shift over time and how that has influenced policies over time. So they're looking at historically the policies to address this issue, how racial bias, racial ideologies in specific inform that, current debates and in issues, what the current issue looks like, and then what are the solutions, what are the proposed solutions, and what do you think about those solutions too? I want to know, now using the tools from the class, what are the blind spots, right? Are there solutions that have been proposed and now you can see it's missing something very important. And then so implementing or including their own voice there as well. And so the other point that was on the slide, there was one more point where I was talking about power in language, and that's a central theme in my research and also in my teaching, that I want people to think about the language we use and how that reproduces inequality, inequity in power and in racial inequity, and in what ways does it promote erasure. So I want to encourage us to think about alternative practices and perspectives that we can engage in to imagine more equitable futures. And we need to address how our language and practices promote erasure, so that moving forward, we can prevent that erasure, right? As we imagine these more equitable futures. Thank you.
Angie, Dr. Beeman. So now the next stage of our next step of our event is also like to engage in conversation with each other, with you all, right? We have like 2 or 3 topics that we wanted to kind of like address together and kind of like start the conversation with this question, but we will love to have your input as well, have your questions, have your comments, so we can have like a community conversation, right? A conversation in community with you all, right? So yeah. One of the topics, yeah, that we wanted to address together, Professor Beeman and I, was the topic of resistance, yeah, to the discussions on racism, to topics in general from Black Studies, right? And kind of like explores, yeah, the ways that we have dealt with that resistance. That resistance can come, yeah, from institutions, yeah, it can come also from students, right? So we wanted to also like to engage in that, right? How also like many times, yeah, these the topics, the central topics of Black Studies present tension within the classroom, right? You want to start, Dr. Beeman?
Sure. I mean, I think in my teaching in Marxe so far, I think what I see more, thankfully, is more of a curiosity and a desire to learn more about these inequities and wanting to discuss what we can do to change them, that there's really a thirst for that. But certainly throughout my career, I've definitely faced a lot of resistance in the classroom, which can come in different forms. I've taught in places where a lot of the faculty were concerned that there were students who were intentionally taking classes just to resist you every step of the way. And it was sort of part of the conservative movements on campus and other networks that they were connected with, that there were people in our classrooms just to do that. And so you have to, this kind of work, it takes a lot of, it can be very exhausting, right? To deal with those different kinds of resistance and to have that fear all the time too, to be, as Jacqueline was saying, we need to discuss this. It's important to be explicit about this and to talk about these uncomfortable topics. And so you can't really, as a professor, you can't really self-censor too much when you want to engage those honest discussions, but at the same time, you're kind of balancing that with being very, very careful, because you know that there is that, not just now, there have been other movements and attacks on ethnic studies in general, not just critical race theory, but you sort of feel that extra scrutiny. So there's a lot of care that you have to take, a lot of extra invisible labor that goes into the teaching of these kinds of courses. I think also there's another kind of, not so much resistance, but I've heard people say about Black and Latino studies and other kinds of courses that I teach, is that it's kind of, oh, those are the fun courses, or like those are the easy courses. Although that must be really interesting to teach. It is really interesting to teach. Fun, it can be, like just with any topic, when you make a difference, that's really meaningful. But they're not easy to teach, I guess. And I think sometimes there's that perception that they must be fun and easy, but because they involve so much of this labor, sometimes I wish that people had more of an understanding of that and what goes into just managing the emotions in it. And then I mean managing like your facial expressions, right? Because people can be saying some crazy things in class, or even your colleague can say some crazy things and you get really good at managing, right? Like your facial expressions, and particularly in class, to make sure everybody is included. So then the last thing too is I think sometimes students are bringing a lot of their frustrations with this inequity too, and a lot of their own trauma. I think that's true about all of us in all of our spaces. And so as a professor teaching these topics, it's tricky managing that too, like where those frustrations and aggressions might go. So and those are just some thoughts on how I manage it.
Yeah. Professor Richardson, you have a question, yeah, or a comment?
I do, yeah, a little bit of both, exactly. I was thinking particularly, Professor Beeman, Angie, when you were saying the kind of critique / slight shade of, oh, that seems like fun. And I think about this a lot, like about the pleasure of being affirmed in the classroom, especially as a person of color, but also the pleasure of being exposed to different ideas. And even at some point, I think, Jacqueline, you may have mentioned it, like the feeling of relief that the filter is finally off. I think these like kinds of affects are, I don't think they're minor. Like, I think these are like critical affects that help us move through the classroom, through our course material, and connect to one another. And I don't know, I just like want to talk more or think more about like not only how beneficial that can be, but how that also may be a form of I'm thinking of resistance in the sense of resisting against systems, almost like creating a more horizontal relationship between students and faculty as opposed to hierarchical, when you actually realize like it felt good to get at something real, even as it was uncomfortable. I don't know, I just think those affects are doing something that I'm still trying to figure out for myself, but like I just want to sort of highlight that as an aspect of the discussion that I feel like is emerging for me as I listen to everyone talk.
Yeah, one thing that in particular for me has been important of teaching like literature and within the topics of Black Studies, for instance, I taught a course on Latin American societies and cultures, right, during colonial times, yeah, and I decided to focus on Black resistance, yeah, in the Caribbean. Right, and of course, yeah, the discussions we have were like difficult because we're dealing with the atrocities of slavery during colonial times. But one thing that I was always like trying to point or signaling towards is like the idea of the creativity of the techniques of resistance, right? And how in these techniques of resistance, yeah, from Black people during colonial times, from the enslaved people, yeah, we have like an affirmation of life, an affirmation of creativity, an affirmation of a world, a different world than the one imposed on them. Yeah, an affirmation of language, an affirmation also of daily practices that challenge colonialism at all times, right? There's also like this idea of rejecting the narrative of the enslaved as passive peoples just suffering, right? We wanted, like in that class, through literary works, we're also looking, yeah, at how like Black people during colonial times were imagining otherwise already. Right, and that was like very important to highlight those elements, even of joy. Yeah, one of the examples is like Juan Francisco Manzano, who was a poet during colonial times in Cuba, an enslaved poet, and we were looking at how like beautiful his poetic work was, and how at all time he was even during like periods of extreme duress and even torture, he was always like thinking about language as a way to escape escape the plantation and to escape the colonial system, right? And those are like moments that I feel like it's important when discussing slavery in particular, that is important to highlight in order to also go beyond this idea of Black suffering, or this conception that only focus on Black suffering. Yeah, we have two more questions. Yeah, Julia, you wanna share comments, thoughts, questions with us?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for these presentations on these courses that I'm so glad our students get to take. I would love to hear both of you say a little bit about strategies that you use to bring students into or to scaffold their engagement with the sort of deeper analysis of some of these complex phenomena. In my own teaching, I've noticed it's quite easy to get students to look at a text or a representation and say, I see a depiction of racism. I see inequality here. Like I can name it, but in my experience, it takes much more particular strategy and sort of planning of class time or planning of student engagement with material to get them to a next level, to be able to meaningfully unpack big abstract concepts like ideology, or even dynamics of privilege and oppression, or politics of representation, for example. So I would love to hear from your own experiences, some of your own strategies.
I think that was one of the questions, right, Rojo, that we are going to ask of each other, sort of similar of what works best. So I think that, so thank you for that, because the way that I love how you have phrased it. I mean, we just had sort of a general question, but I like how you have really honed in on that issue of these are really deep ideological concepts, and how do you scaffold that? How do you break that down? Which is an important part of what I try to do in my work and in my teaching. So one of the things, and my students here can tell me if they hate it or love it, I think that it's really intense at first, but I start seemingly small with getting them. So if it's a course that's focused on racial inequity or race and ethnic relations, I start with the concept of race and the concept of whiteness. And that is a story of oppression and victimization, but it's also a story of empowerment. And so I try to make that clear. So I have them watch, for example, Race, the Power of an Illusion, Part 1. It's a 3-part series. We watch it throughout the semester. So you watch Part 1 and start out to understand the Human Genome Project and what are these arguments of biology and race. Okay, so now read not the book, Race in North America, which is a thick, dense book, but just read the interview that the author of that book gives, where it's a sort of conversational style where she talks about this deep history of the construction of whiteness and Blackness in a very conversational style. I think it's like 4 pages. And then after you do that, write a discussion board, sort of low stakes, about your experiences. When did you first learn about race and racism? What did you learn about those experiences? And so I find that gives them like a moment to reflect back on, and I share with them in some of my research, some of the European American activists will say, I learned about it because I saw it happen to my friends in school when we were tracked. We were all together in elementary school. And now looking back, we were all separated by middle school. And I didn't understand it then, but now looking back, I'm thinking about what my teacher said, what that experience was like. And so it gets them thinking about what the concept is, that may be abstract. And then we can get into the deep history step by step. I have them come in, they do it in class writing. We talk about it. I give them the lecture. And then after that, they read more of the dense history, which is getting at, basically, I give them a piece by Carter Wilson, who's a political scientist. So a lot of this is very interdisciplinary. And it's a really thick chapter. So I have them sit and talk about how these racial ideologies were constructed in different ways, and make for me a list as you're talking about what are the key points that you learned from that. They put it on the board, and then I tell them, okay, next time what I want you to do is you go back, take these lists and make a theoretical model from these lists. And what this author has is a really good theoretical model, but he doesn't draw it from us. He gives it, or for us, he gives us all this dense stuff. He doesn't draw it for us. You draw it for us. And so it's their unique contribution where I say there's 3 factors: racist culture, economic structure, and political elites. Take this list, draw me a model, and tell me how it's all interconnected. And I get these beautiful models that I want to use. Like, I wish that I tell them, I wish I could have hired you for my book, because I want your model, not mine in my book. I want you to draw it. So it makes them, it's like, it takes a lot of energy and effort to think through these things, to think really hard about these concepts. And I want them to, right? I want them to think and put in the work, but then they produce something concrete with their own thinking that helps them to wrap their minds around these complex concepts in connection with their own experiences. So that's what I found.
Yeah, in my case, I also like start in a specific discourse I was telling you about at the one debates in Latin American social theory. We also like engage into a discussion on Euro-modern racial logics. Yeah, the idea of blackness, the idea of whiteness as well, and we explore from different perspectives. We read theoretical and philosophical texts. Yeah, for example, Achille Mbembe, The Subject of Race. Yeah, from the Critique of Black Reason. That is like a more like heavy theoretical text, yeah, that talks principally on blackness, right? And 2 possibilities of understanding blackness from the point of view of auto-modernity, right? Blackness as a noun, yeah, that pinpoints towards an objectification of African people, right? But he also covers, yeah, the idea of blackness as solidarity, as a discourse on solidarity, right? And we also saw that same discourse with Pedro Lebrón Ortiz, who was an independent scholar who we were in conversation recently in the Black Studies Colloquium, and he presented also from a philosophical point of view, but he talks about this idea of maroon logics as a flight from those logics, yeah, those logics, oppressive logics on blackness, and as an example of fleeing from the plantation, and he looks at that action of fleeing from the plantation also from the point of view of current ecological movement in the Caribbean, in particular in Puerto Rico, especially after the circumstances of Hurricane Maria, and to complement those like more heavy theoretical discussion, we also saw one perspective on maroons and on racial logics from the point of view of creation of spaces and maroon communities, geographies, right? But we also complement those discussions with cultural works, such as the film Quilombo, that we also were engaged in conversation. Professor Richardson and Professor Mouse from the Black and Latino Studies department, we were engaged in conversation about like, right, how like the different levels, right, and the complexities of that films to describe resistance to slavery, resistance to colonialism, but also to affirm African ways of being, and to imagine also the past, right? The film as an act that is also reimagining the archive, right? And trying to challenge the silences of the archive, right? That is something that we also discuss in the classroom by using the film Quilombo, and also the poetry collection has been very successful in our class. We are old, right? Ariana Brown talks about the maroon leader Gaspar Yanga in Mexico, right? And how she decided that when she's understanding her Mexicanidad, her Mexicanness, yeah, she's like actually looking at Yanga as a central figure to understand her Mexican side, because it implies, yeah, that alliance with Black liberation, that alliance with Black culture, diasporic Black culture. And that poetry collection has been like really great to bring those points through a creative perspective. So that the different levels of discourses, from philosophical, theoretical, film discourses, poetic discourses, has been like really great to bring and to add complexity to these discussions, right? Anna, you have a question, a comment that you want to share with us?
I do, thanks. I have to be off camera right now, but this has been really useful and interesting, and I love hearing more about everything you're doing such creative things in your classrooms. And so I want to bring it back a little bit to something that Professor Richardson brought up earlier, and something that's about affirming our students in the classroom. And I keep asking the same question to myself and to others for a while now, which is, and I put in the chat, for those of us who are teaching on subjects that are I shouldn't say unrelated. Very little in this country is unrelated to race, but that it's not directly related to race, right? And not directly related to, not having the opportunity to, not being scholars in this area. For me, as an example, I'm an economist. I see my colleague Tiffany here, who's I guess you do the social movements class, Tiffany, but also she teaches a general communications class for our MPA students, and I'm just wondering, as I talk to folks, who teach in the core curriculum and these required courses that range in subjects, I'm wondering, I guess, two things. One is back to Erica, Richardson's comment about really affirming our students in the classroom, and not just affirming our students, but even if we don't have a lot, for example, of Black students as an example in the classroom, affirming Black lives in the classroom, doing that explicitly, through, I've been trying to do it by incorporating different discussions of history. Someone put in the chat, like bringing up the history, and so in my economics course, I weave in some of those things, but I'm wondering, this brings me to my second question. So any suggestions on that broadly about affirming students, especially when we don't maybe have Black students in our class, as an example, right? So it's just, affirming all our students, but also really trying to, really trying to affirm the importance of Black lives, even in these different contexts, right? And then the second question is, I'm just curious, and I'm sure there are people who are doing this, though not so much in economics, because I've really tried to search for this, but this, you mentioned, both you, Rojo and Angie, you both mentioned the importance of kind of interdisciplinary work, and Rojo, you're just describing all these different beautiful kind of creative elements that you're bringing into your classes. And I think that is part of bringing the humanity and affirming our students. And it is much more challenging in economics as a discipline. We weren't trained like that. And so I'm wondering about how to incorporate some of the elements that you've given us today here into other courses, and so not to put it all on you, I know that you're all doing innovative stuff in your area, and I'm just kind of wondering how we can take more of this and spread the love, because I really feel like we need it across different disciplines, and our students need the tools, especially at the Marxe School. I mean, actually throughout Baruch, they need the tools to understand how to navigate and negotiate this society that is, both pluralist and also racist at the same time. So thank you for that. Thank you for this whole presentation.
Yeah, I would like to say that one thing that I find really useful to affirm students, and definitely Black students, it's the idea also of student-centered pedagogy, and also to make the student participate in all the decision-making, right, and the development of all the projects within your class. Right. For instance, my students have weekly assignments, but they decide the route that they want to take within that assignment, give it different options. And even there's always an option that they can create their own options to react to any given source. Right. The same goes for the midterm. We do a survey. Right. I do a survey and I ask them what they would like to do their projects about, what topics resonated with them, what things they would like to explore further in their research, and what type of project they would like to develop. And of course, I give them some prompts that help them clarify the possibilities within the class, and kind of integrate the sources. But the questions from the midterm, from the final, also comes from them. They're the one who create the approach to the sources that we are engaging with, and that I feel or at least my intention is that guarantees that they're going to be invested in the work that they're doing. They're not I hope that they don't feel that they're forced to write on something that they don't necessarily feel comfortable writing about, or they even like care about, right? It's more about what things I would like to write, I would like to create based on what we have been discussing together as a community. And I feel that it's a great way to like always like center their input into the design of the class.
Okay, so, and I think that including on your syllabus authors, right? So Black authors or authors of color. And, you know, for example, so, you know, I'm not an economist, but when I taught sociological theory, I always shared the Chilean economist's work, Manfred Max Neef, who had just really a beautiful perspective on thinking about poverty and how we study poverty. And he had a perspective from as being an economist, where he thought there were problems with that. And my students really connected with that, although it wasn't an economics class, it was sociological theory. I think Derek Hamilton as well. So there are, I think, for people who, whether it's economics or whatever field where you feel like the paradigm is really not, that there's sort of a dominant paradigm that is really hard to break or get people to see differently. It's about reaching out to those people who do that. I've written a book review for Kathy Mulder, and we've developed a relationship. She's an economist at John Jay who is really always up against that paradigm in economics. And she talks about that, although it's not so much with race and racism for her, it's more about gender and thinking differently about, her work is on worker-owned cooperatives, or what she calls worker-centered self-directed enterprises. And so she studies this globally. So it's about like finding, I think, for people in those fields, others you can talk to and have community around and learn from them how they include it. Because I know there's some economists who do that, right? So it's about finding that and asking them, like, what are the sources that you use in your class, right? I'm a sociologist, but what do you use in your classes that really work? And how can you integrate this everywhere? So even if it's in an introduction class or a sociological theory class, which can be taught in a very white-centric way, right? I've often tell people you can get a PhD in sociology and never have to learn about Du Bois. Certainly when I was there, it's changing a little bit now. But, you know, I think it was Alden Morris who wrote the book, The Scholar Denied, about Du Bois and how Du Bois really influenced a lot of this scholarship. So when I started teaching sociological theory, I was sure to put Du Bois there and to talk about how Max Weber, who we all learn about, a lot of his ideas probably are where he's credited about, like, look, he talks about status and social construction of race and these things. Well, where do you think he got these other ideas? Did you know that he stayed with him in Germany? He stayed with Du Bois, stayed with Max Weber. So he likely got that from Du Bois. So I sort of turn the lens and the critique on my own field. I used to do that in sociological theory, and that was a way of sort of affirming people who have been denied, as Du Bois was, and scholars who've been marginalized.
Yeah, another thing that I will say also, like, to bring it back to the present, always, like, even like when you're discussing like historical processes that maybe took place like centuries ago, but also like how they resonate with our present, how the legacies of slavery, colonialism are still with us, right? One of the most successful articles in our class, I will say, and Jacqueline was posting it on the chat box, is like From Woe to Wonder by Araceli Guillemey. Guillemey is Afro-Boricua of African descent as well, Eritrean descent as well. And she talks about, right, Black resistant colonialism, maroon communities, but she talks about those topics from the point of view of the movement for Black life, and how to talk about the killings of Black people by the police, by the US police, from the perspective of a mother in Brooklyn. And she's also talking about education, childhood education, how to talk about racism, how to talk about whiteness, how to talk about Blackness, but she brings that discussion by inserting it within current debates, debates that resonate with our current debates on the media. And that particular essay was, she published it during 2020, during the protests. So it was extremely relevant, and I feel like it's still deeply relevant. But at the same time, she's also talking about Maroon communities and their ways of resisting slavery. And she was talking also about whiteness as a legacy that comes with colonialism. And she's also talking about the Lenape people, right? And the ecologies that we have lost because, of colonization. But the fact that she's bringing or centering that discussion within current debates really helps students resonate and feel that they're invested, that they're currently living these debates as well, right? Erica, you want to share some more with us?
I was just thinking about the conversation as it was unfolding. And I also wanted to say, like, I often think of interdisciplinary as being interdisciplinary is ideally implicitly collaborative. And in that respect, it's like, when I hear these different sort of strategies for how to affirm students, I especially like that student-centered approach that you were bringing up, Rojo, because I think even when it comes to, say, making those interventions within economics, I don't know if you have to do all that by yourself, Anna. Like, I think, like, you can, and I think ideally in terms of timeline of the semester, doing it like early, not at the very beginning, but like early on, like creating an invitation for your students to find that thing that like gets us to notice something else about how economics is studied, or what topics are explored, or what categories don't usually come up. So that way it's not just, because my panic is always in these moments of like, how much more reading do I have to do? Even when I'm like deeply motivated to do the reading, like how am I gonna find it? And I think like also considering like your students as contributing to said syllabus, or like presenting that other voice that sort of, even if it's just one good example, if you have that good model of like the person in your field who is pushing back a little bit, it's like you can ask the question again as you move through all the sort of like canonical or requirements that you have to do. Like, we saw someone do this early on. Remember how this person pushed back a little bit? How might we do this right now? Like, and the nice part about that, or the part that I find like creative engaging, is that it's open-ended. Like, you don't know what they're going to come up with. You don't know what they're going to say to make the next intervention. So I just, and also for others who may be compelled by anything that we're saying right now, I'll also say Anna and I will be running a workshop for faculty next week on April 5th to further discuss, like, as much as she was indicating that in our different disciplines and fields, there is sort of that challenge of like, how do we actually like implement this, or what does this look like in our syllabus? So I, as much as I am like thinking aloud, I'm also shamelessly making a plug for the second part of this particular program, and I'll drop the link into the chat as well.
And I think I just wanted to add, I think that some of this is speaking to the issue that I raised and some of the work that I've done in terms of the negative impacts of all of these moves towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, there's that issue of that whole language problem, but when we are asked, when our institutions are asking us to do this work, where is the work falling, right? How are faculty and staff being affected by that, in particular faculty and staff of color who are likely doing this work? How are we recognizing that labor and rewarding that labor? Or because a lot of us are just going to feel used, you know, like a lot of the work is falling on us, but what support are we getting? And then there's also this issue of, you know, kind of this issue of, does every syllabus have to have this perspective on it? So some people would argue like, yes, it should be in every class and everybody should be putting it on their syllabus and teaching it. But some people are not, they have never done any of this work. So in some sense, I see that as good. And I kind of agree with that. It should be on all of these, on the syllabus, and everybody should be trying to implement this. But I don't want, my concern with that is that I don't want people who are not well equipped to deal with this issue. It's almost like disrespectful to those of us who've been doing this work for a very long time. and disrespectful to this area as a field of study, as a serious field of study, that you can just throw it on your syllabus, right? Like we want everybody to do it. And so I would like to see some care around that and recognition that not everybody is right now equipped to teach it. And it's like some of us got a PhD in this stuff, like it was our whole career, and it does take that effort. So I don't know. So I kind of want to see that discussion happening as well. And also recognition, reward, what have you, for the people who have been doing this work for a very long time. That I think that's an issue that I've seen in interviews that I've done with faculty and staff of color.
Sedali.
Hi, everyone. Of course, I
Hi.
absolutely love, this session, this work. It's so important, and it's so wonderful to be able to hear Dr. Robles and Dr. Beeman share their work. I'm always so very excited to be a part of these spaces. I also want to say, that when we're thinking about resistance in the classroom, and how we're addressing some of these issues with students, that there's got to be an incredible level of self-care that goes into it, right? Just really honing in on the idea that trying to discuss these types of issues, and I'm in the management department, so it's a little bit different for me, on the other side, but I incorporate this work in the class that I'm teaching, right? Even though it's not my beloved evolution and expressions of racism or race and ethnicity, I think that there's relevance in the work that we're doing that addresses systemic racism in institutions throughout. And I see it in the work that Angie does and the work that we do together. But I think one of the things that she points at is the level of invisible labor, right? That not just the faculty member, but a lot of the students, right, of students of color in particular, are having to engage in to have these conversations, but also the thirst to learn and kind of engage in the work more deeply. The amount of work that goes into that has to be recognized, particularly at the student level. And all of our classes don't have, Black students in it, which is very traumatizing. Right? To think that we're at a CUNY and we're at Baruch and there aren't a lot of Black students in the classroom, but we're having conversations. But these conversations are incredibly important because you don't need to just have Black students in the room to have these conversations, right? It's a way of emphasizing the importance of Black lives and experiences, those of other BIPOC as well, to show what it looks like for us to be in the spaces. And the last thing I'm going to say is there are RFPs coming out that is spearheaded by Brezzi. And I think that it's super important for us to keep an eye out on that so that we may be able to take advantage of how we can use some of the resources available to really uplift and push the kind of work that we want to really be embedded, right, within CUNY and Baruch and the different schools here, and not just, surface level in this moment performance kind of work. And since you're all doing it, I suggest that we, really plug into that as much as we can. Thank you.
It's almost 2 p.m. So I feel like we should we can finish our conversation today as Anna and Erica were saying, we're gonna have a part 2 of this event, and we're gonna keep exploring the issue of pedagogy, of research, and the exploration of different takes on Black studies, right? And on the topics that we have explored today, right? So we're looking forward to engage with Erica, with Anna, and with you all on part 2 of Black futures in the classroom. Right. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for engaging with us. And we'll see you on the next one. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
I can go ahead and end it if you like.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know if you wanted to check in. Oh, there goes Roxana. I was gonna tell her thank you for coming, but I'll I'll check in with her later. Okay, good.
Hold on one